Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about Philip Sidney's essay, An Apology for Poetry. An Apology for Poetry, also titled The Defense of Poesy, written around 1580 and published in 1595. Philip Sidney, 1554-1586. An Apology for Poetry, or The Defense of Poesy, was written by Sir Philip Sidney around 1580, published posthumously in 1595. It is one of the earliest works of English literary criticism. It is written in response to Puritan attacks on poetry, especially those by Stephen Gosson, who criticized the poetry as immoral and misleading. Philip Sidney defends the role of poetry in society, arguing that it is not only entertaining but also instructive and morally beneficial. The exchange between Philip Sidney and Stephen Gosson is a pivotal moment in the Elizabethan literary debate over the moral and social value of poetry. Stephen Gosson's attack, The School of Abuse, 1579. Stephen Gosson, a former playwright turned moralist, published The School of Abuse in 1579. In this treatise, Gosson condemned poetry, drama and music as immoral, corrupting and idle entertainments. Gosson associated poets and playwrights with the sinful pleasures, calling them instruments of lust and vice. Gosson attacked the theatrical scene in London, claiming it promoted immorality and distracted people from virtuous living. Ironically, Gosson dedicated this anti-poetry pamphlet to Sir Philip Sidney, perhaps assuming Sidney shared his moralistic outlook or to gain protection. So in response to Stephen Gosson's work, Sidney wrote the work, An Apology for Poetry. Now let's analyze the main points. Definition of poetry. Philip Sidney defines poetry broadly, including fiction, drama, and even philosophical writings. He says, poetry is an art of imitation that aims to teach and delight. Poets do not merely describe reality, but create an idealized version of it, inspiring virtue and knowledge. The superiority of poetry over other disciplines. Sidney argues that poetry is superior to philosophy and history in teaching morality. Philosophy teaches moral principles, but in an abstract way that is difficult to apply in real life. History provides examples of past events, but it does not always teach moral lessons, as history records both virtuous and wicked individuals. Poetry, however, presents idealized characters and events, teaching moral lessons in an engaging and emotional way. Example, a poet can create a perfectly virtuous hero who inspires readers to be better. The role of the poet. The poet is a creator similar to God, who forms new and imaginative worlds. Unlike historians and philosophers, poets are not limited by facts or rigid logic. They have the freedom to inspire and uplift. Poetry has the power to shape human emotions, influence behavior, and instill virtue. defense against criticism of poetry. Philip Sidney responds to 4 common criticisms of poetry. First one, poetry is a waste of time. Sidney argues that poetry inspires and educates, making it both useful and enjoyable. The second argument, that is, poetry is full of lies. Sidney counters that poets do not claim to tell literal truths like historians. Instead, they create fictional truths that express deeper moral and philosophical insights. Third argument, that is, poetry encourages immorality. Sidney acknowledges that some poetry can be immoral, but argues that the best poetry promotes virtue. He claims that bad poetry is the fault of bad poets, not poetry itself. The fourth argument, Plato banned poets from his ideal republic. Sidney clarifies that Plato only criticized the bad poets, not poetry as a whole. Plato himself used the poetic language and allegory in his works. The importance of poetry in society. Poetry has historically been highly respected. In ancient times, poets were considered wise and noble figures. Great civilizations like Greece and Rome valued poetry for educating and inspiring people. Sidney urges England to embrace poetry as a tool for national and moral improvement. Sidney ends with a passionate call for poetry to be recognized as a valuable and necessary art. He encourages poets to write with purpose and a moral insight. He concludes by criticizing those who do not appreciate poetry, calling them barbarous and lacking in wisdom. Now let's understand the meaning of the title, An Apology for Poetry. The word apology comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a speech in defense, famously used in Plato's work Apology, where Socrates defends himself. The title tells us that this is a philosophical rebuttal to the charges against poetry raised by Stephen Gosen, and not a confession or apology in the modern sense. Now let's analyze the images and symbols used by Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry is rich in classical and Renaissance imagery and symbolism, which he uses to elevate poetry above other forms of learning, like history, philosophy, and even rhetoric. The first imagery, the poet as a maker or waits. Symbol. The poet as a maker, that is from the Greek word poin, is a prophet, that is waits in Latin. Meaning, Sidney portrays the poet as a divinely inspired creator, linking poetry to prophecy and a sacred insight. Implication. Poetry is not mere entertainment, it is a noble, almost a sacred art, closer to divine truth than other disciplines. The golden world versus the brazen world. Symbol. The golden world imagined by poets versus the brazen world, that is the real corrupt world. Meaning, poets shape an ideal world that surpasses reality, showing what ought to be rather than what is. Implication. Poetry uplifts the human spirit by envisioning moral beauty and virtue, whereas history and philosophy are confined to facts or abstractions. Poetry is a light or lantern. Symbol. Light symbolizes illumination, clarity, and moral guidance. Meaning, poetry lights the way to virtue by delighting, teaching, and moving its readers. Implication. Unlike a dry philosophy, poetry uses emotional resonance and a beauty to guide readers toward a goodness. The poet as a guide or teacher. Symbol. The poet is likened to a teacher with a sweetened pill or a guide on a moral path. Meaning, poetry blends pleasure and instruction. It makes learning desirable by clocking truth in a beautiful language. Implication. This positions poetry as the most effective ethical educator of all arts. Pegasus and Mount Helicon. Symbol. Classical references like a Pegasus, that is the winged horse of the Muses, and a Helicon, that is the mountain sacred to the Muses. Meaning, these images celebrate poetry's mythical roots and a divine inspiration. Implication. Poetry has noble origins and aligns itself with a transcendent creativity and a cultural enlightenment. The poet versus the philosopher and a historian. Symbol. Each figure represents a form of knowledge. The philosopher teaches with a ruled abstract. The historian teaches with examples, that is limited to facts. The poet combines both with imaginative force. Implication. Poetry is the synthesis of moral truth and a vivid representation, making it a superior in influence. Poetry as a sword with a gilded scabbard. Symbol. Poetry is like a weapon, there is truth, with a beautiful cover, there is pleasure. Meaning, the moral message is hidden in delight, making it more readily accepted. Implication. Poetry persuades and reforms better than logic or historical precedent. The Trojan horse used to criticize drama. Symbol. Sidney criticizes immoral drama as a Trojan horse, enticing on the outside but morally corrupt inside. Meaning, he warns against poetry or plays that entertain but mislead. Implication. Poetry must be morally responsible, not just clever or popular. The poet as a monarch or ruler of arts. Symbol. The poet is metaphorically placed at the top of the hierarchy of learning. Meaning, poetry is the foundation and culmination of all human knowledge, since it blends imagination with ethics and truth. Implication. Sidney defends poetry as the first light giver to ignorance, a civilizing force. Delight, teach, and move. Threefold function of poetry. Symbols. Delight, that is pleasure. Teach, that means instruction. Move, that means inspiration to act. Meaning, these are not visual images, but conceptual pillars, symbolizing poetry's complete influence on the human soul. Implication. A poem's beauty entices, its message instructs, and its power inspires change, a unique moral tool. Now it's time for us to go to the main quotations from the essay. First one, poetry is the first light giver to ignorance. Philip Sidney views poetry as the earliest form of instruction in human history. Before structured sciences or religions, poetry educated people through myths, songs, and moral tales. It brought a clarity and a moral insight where there was none. Poetry, therefore, holds a primary role in the evolution of thought. Now the next quote. The poet nothing affirms and therefore never lieth. Poets create imaginary worlds without claiming factual truth. Sidney argues that since poets do not assert literal facts, they cannot be accused of lying. They present moral truths in a veiled artistic way. Thus, poetry is immune to the charges of falsehood that a philosopher or historians might face. Now the next quote. To teach and delight. This classical Horatian principle is central to Philip Sidney's defense. Poetry serves both instruction and entertainment, engaging the mind and the heart. Through delight, readers become more receptive to moral teachings. This dual function makes poetry more effective than dry philosophy or factual history. Now the next quote. Poetry is more philosophical than history. While history deals with the particulars, poetry deals with the universal. History is bound by real events. Poetry constructs ideal moral truths. Poets show not just what happened, but what should happen. Hence, poetry transcends the limitations of both the fact and the abstraction. Now moving on to the next quote. Poets were the first bringers of civil society. Philip Sidney credits early poets with taming barbaric societies by inspiring them with stories of order, justice, and virtue. Figures like Orpheus and Homer helped establish moral values and social cooperation. Poetry was not just entertainment, but a civilizing force. It functioned as the moral educator of the masses. Now the next quote. The golden world versus the brazen world. Poets create a golden world of ideals, unlike the flawed brazen world of reality. The poetic world illustrates virtue in its purest form, offering inspiration and hope. It reveals the moral possibilities of humanity. In this way, poetry corrects and uplifts reality. Moving on to the next quote. Delightful teaching. Philip Sidney insists that learning is more effective when it is enjoyable. Poetry's charm and beauty draw readers in, softening their resistance to moral instruction. It packages ethical insight in memorable, moving narratives. Pleasure is not a distraction, but a means to enlightenment. The next quote. Plato banished poets from his republic. Philip Sidney counters Plato's criticism by arguing that Plato himself was a poetic in style and depended on allegory. He suggests the real danger lies in corrupt poetry, not poetry itself. Good poetry promotes virtue and discipline. Therefore, Plato's critique should be read carefully and not taken as a condemnation of all poets. Now the next quote, the poet as a maker. From the Greek word poieni, meaning to make, Sidney emphasizes the poet's role as a creator. This creative function is akin to divine activity, shaping beauty and meaning from imagination. Poets invent rather than imitate. They do not just mirror nature, they transcend it. Now the next quote, nature's child and a stepchild. Philip Sidney compares philosophy to nature's true child and poetry to its stepchild. Though poetry may seem removed from nature, it reveals deeper moral truths. It interprets nature not through science, but through emotion and idealism. Poetry is an adopted heir to nature's wisdom. Moving on to the next quote. Poetry moves to virtuous action. While philosophy teaches what is right, poetry inspires people to do what is right. It appeals to emotions and awakens the will. This emotional power motivates ethical behavior more effectively than logic. Thus, poetry is transformative, not just theoretical. Next quote. Feigned histories. Philip Sidney defends poetic fiction by emphasizing its moral purpose. Poets use a fictional scenario to portray truth more vividly than real-life accounts. These feigned histories teach by showing consequences of choices. The imagined is made more powerful than the actual. Now the next quote, a speaking picture. Philip Sidney calls poetry a speaking picture, blending the visual and verbal. Like painting, poetry creates vivid mental imagery, but it adds moral and narrative depth through language. It paints with words, stirring both mind and soul. Poetry is art that speaks and guides. Now the next quote. The peerless poet. Philip Sidney elevates poets above all other professionals. They combine ethical philosophy, emotional depth, and artistic form. They have the power to inspire, reform, and virtue. Thus the poet becomes a guide, artist, and a visionary all at once. The next line. Pegasus and Mount Helicon. Philip Sidney invokes classical symbols of poetic inspiration. Pegasus, the winged horse, the Mount Helicon, home of the muses, represented divine creativity and poetic excellence. These images link poetry to something sacred and transcendent. Poetry, therefore, is not mere craft, but an inspired art. Now the next quote. No learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue. This underscores the practical moral function of education. Poetry surpasses other disciplines because it is not only informs, but also motivates. Knowledge without action is barren. Poetry bridges this gap. It turns theory into inner conviction and outer behavior. The next quote. Poetry is the companion of religion. Philip Sidney aligns poetry with the spirituality and the divine revelation. Prophets and sacred texts often use poetic forms to communicate divine truths. Poetry, therefore, has the capacity to elevate the soul. It is both earthly and spiritual in its reach. The next quote. Evil poetry is like a Trojan horse. Philip Sidney warns that corrupt poetry can disguise harmful messages in a beautiful language. Like the Trojan horse, it may look noble but bring destruction. This suggests the poet's ethical responsibility. Beauty must serve truth and goodness, not deception. Now the next quote. Verses of scripture are most heavenly. Philip Sidney points to biblical poetry, for example psalms, as evidence of poetry's divine function. Religious texts use rhythm, metaphor, and imagination to convey profound truth. This legitimizes poetic form as morally and spiritually valid. Sacred poetry transcends mere human invention. The next quote. The poet leads and draws us with a delight to knowledge. Philip Sidney closes his argument by returning to poetry's capacity to entice, educate, and inspire. Unlike cold logic, poetry touches the heart and fires the imagination. It invites the soul to ascend toward truth willingly. Poetry is a gentle master that molds character and intellect.